This is me, July 29th, 2008. It is 12:33 Mountain Time. Covering all my bases, making sure that if something happens to me or my family or all of us, that our assets are documented. Hope everything works out and we're all happy and live happily ever after as much as that's possible.
She was a devoted mother, a loving wife, and by all accounts, someone who should have been safe inside her own home. But one winter night in Utah, she vanished, leaving behind nothing but a half-cleaned carpet, 2 sleeping children, and a story that never made sense. She walked into her home one Sunday evening in December 2009 and was never seen again. It was a freezing Sunday night in West Valley City, Utah. Snow blanketed the streets, and Christmas lights flickered across quiet houses. Inside the Powell home, Susan and her husband Josh were getting ready for another week. Their 2 little boys, Charlie and Braden, were playing in the living room while Susan folded laundry. Friends would later remember her last message that evening, a simple email she sent around 5 p.m. chatting about a recipe and Christmas plans. Nothing seemed unusual, but by morning, everything had changed. When Susan didn't show up for work on Monday, her co-workers grew concerned. She was punctual, reliable, the kind of person who would never miss a shift without calling. They tried calling her phone. No answer. Then they called her husband, Josh. Still nothing. By mid-morning, friends drove to her house. The cars were there, lights off, no sound inside. They knocked, called her name. No response. Through the frosted glass, they could see small coats hanging by the door, the children's shoes neatly lined up beside them. It looked like the family had just stepped out. But something was wrong. Police were called. When they entered the house, they found no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no forced entry. But something felt strange, unnaturally clean, almost like someone had tried to erase something. Fans were running in different rooms, and on the living room carpet, a small wet patch, freshly cleaned. Susan was nowhere to be found. Hours later that afternoon, Josh Powell finally returned home with their 2 sons. He seemed calm, even casual, as police approached him. When asked where Susan was, his answer sent chills through the room. "Oh, she must be at work. I took the boys camping last night." Camping, in the middle of a snowstorm, at midnight, on a Sunday night, with 2 toddlers. Detectives couldn't believe it. The weather had dropped below freezing. Every park and trail was covered in ice. But Josh insisted he'd gone to Simpson Springs, a remote desert spot in western Utah. He said they'd left around midnight and returned that morning. The story didn't fit. It didn't fit the weather, the timeline, or basic logic. When police checked Susan's belongings, her purse, her car keys, her cell phone, they were all still at home. It was as if she had simply vanished from her own living room. Within hours, the story spread across Utah. Flyers went up, volunteers gathered, helicopters searched the desert where Josh claimed to have camped. But there was no trace, no tracks, no campsite, nothing. And as each hour passed, the unease grew. Susan Powell, a 28-year-old mother of 2, had disappeared into thin air, and her husband's story was full of holes. Detectives began to dig into the Powell's life. At first glance, they seemed like a typical young family. 2 kids, a mortgage, a modest home, active in their church. But once police started talking to Susan's friends and co-workers, a different picture began to form. They learned Susan had confided in friends that her marriage was falling apart, that Josh was controlling, obsessive about money, and prone to anger, that she had even started keeping a journal, documenting her fears, and recording videos of herself and her possessions just in case. One entry just weeks before she vanished read, "If something happens to me, it may look like an accident, but it won't be." Those words would echo for years. Back at the house, police began collecting evidence. And the more they looked, the stranger things became. There were no signs of forced entry, no note. But Susan's favorite blanket was gone. A spot on the couch had been scrubbed clean, and the fans had been running all night, blowing air across a freshly washed floor. It was as if someone had tried to erase what happened there. Over the next 48 hours, Josh's behavior grew even more bizarre. Instead of helping search parties, he hired an attorney. He refused to take a polygraph. He told detectives inconsistent details, first saying he left at midnight, then 12:30, then that Susan had been asleep when he left. When police asked his young son what had happened that night, the boy said something chilling. "Mommy came with us, but she didn't come back." That single sentence changed everything. Within days, police classified Susan Powell's disappearance as suspicious. Search teams scoured the Utah desert, combing through miles of frozen land. Cadaver dogs were deployed. Helicopters scanned from above, but not a single clue surfaced. And as the days turned to weeks, the hope of finding her alive began to fade. For Susan's family, the waiting was torture. They knew her. They knew she wouldn't just leave her kids behind. She had been scared, but she had also been preparing to leave Josh, to start fresh. She'd spoken about separating, about finding safety for her and the boys. It was as if someone had silenced her before she ever got the chance. As Christmas approached, her home stood empty. Lights still strung across the windows, gifts half-wrapped, and her name echoing on every news channel across Utah. And behind, the calm voice of her husband, behind the soft snow covering their quiet street, there was something dark, something that felt like the truth was buried just beneath the surface. The search for Susan Powell had begun, but no one knew that this was just the beginning of a story that would spiral into obsession, control, family secrets, and an ending no one could have imagined. What happened to Susan Powell that winter night in 2009 would haunt America for years to come. The disappearance of Susan Powell had now become the biggest mystery in Utah. But as investigators dug deeper into the Powell family, what they found wasn't just strange, it was disturbing. Josh Powell's behavior had gone from suspicious to unsettling. He didn't cry in interviews. He didn't beg for his wife's return. He didn't even seem interested in helping the search teams. Instead, Josh spent his time cleaning his house, moving boxes and buying new cell phones. To police, it felt like he was hiding something. Then, investigators turned their attention to the man behind Josh, his father, Steve Powell. Steve lived in Puyallup, Washington, and when detectives visited him, they quickly realized something was very, very wrong. He didn't seem sad that his daughter-in-law was missing. He seemed fascinated. Steve told police that Susan had secretly been in love with him. He said they shared a special connection, that she flirted with him, and that he had love songs and videos to prove it. When police looked into those claims, what they discovered was horrifying. Inside Steve's home, investigators found an entire collection dedicated to Susan, hundreds of photographs of her, taken without her knowing. Videos of her doing normal, everyday things, gardening, folding laundry, playing with her kids. Even a collection of her used hygiene items, tissues, cotton swabs, nail clippings, stored in labeled plastic bags. Steve Powell was obsessed with Susan. He had filmed her constantly, keeping secret notes about her body and her expressions. He called her beautiful, pure, the one who got away. Detectives realized that what they were looking at wasn't just a controlling husband's world, it was a family consumed by delusion and manipulation. As the investigation spread between Utah and Washington, Susan's friends told police that she had long been uncomfortable with Steve's behavior. She avoided visiting him. She once told friends she caught him recording her through a bathroom door, and yet Josh seemed unfazed by his father's obsession. The two shared a disturbing bond, built on control, secrecy, and paranoia. Meanwhile, Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, fought tirelessly to keep her story alive. They held vigils, searched deserts, and pleaded with the public to help. They believed from the beginning that Josh knew exactly what had happened, but without a body, there was no proof. Then, a new clue surfaced, one that would change everything. Detectives obtained Susan's digital journals and recordings she had left behind with a friend. In them, Susan described years of emotional abuse. She talked about how Josh controlled every aspect of her life, her finances, her friends, even what she cooked for dinner. She wrote, "He's always watching, always angry. I don't feel safe anymore." She also mentioned how Josh had recently taken out a massive life insurance policy on her. By January 2010, 1 month after her disappearance, public opinion had shifted. The community no longer saw Josh as a grieving husband. They saw him as the prime suspect. Detectives requested that Josh submit to another round of questioning. This time, they confronted him with evidence, the inconsistencies, the cleaned carpet, the timeline. He refused to cooperate. He demanded his lawyer. When asked if he would take a polygraph test, he laughed and said no. Soon after, he packed up his belongings, quit his job, and took the boys, Charlie and Braden, to Washington State, moving into his father's home. It was a move that stunned everyone, including police. The investigation continued, but Josh was out of reach. Back in Utah, the Cox family continued to search for answers. They organized massive search efforts: deserts, mines, lakes, forests, anything that could hold a clue. But months passed, and Susan's name began to fade from the headlines. Then something happened that brought her case back into national attention. In 2011, police in Washington obtained a warrant to search Steve Powell's home again, this time for digital evidence. What they found went far beyond Susan. Hidden in hard drives and disks were thousands of images of young neighborhood girls, many taken without consent. Voyeuristic photos, recordings, and more disturbing material. Steve Powell was arrested on charges of voyeurism and child pornography. When police seized his computers, they found even more files and hundreds of references to Susan Powell. But even after his arrest, Josh remained uncooperative. He appeared on TV giving emotionless interviews, claiming Susan had run away with another man. He said, "She's out there somewhere. She'll come back when she wants to." No one believed him. At this point, child custody became a growing concern. The Cox family fought to gain access to the children, fearing for their safety. They argued that the environment inside the Powell home was dangerous, especially with Steve in prison and Josh showing erratic behavior. The court agreed. In 2012, custody of Charlie and Braden was temporarily granted to Susan's parents. For the first time in 2 years, the boys were safe. But Josh didn't take that decision well. He grew more unpredictable, more desperate. He told social workers he was being treated unfairly. He felt like everyone was against him. And then, on February 5th, 2012, something happened that would shock the entire nation. That morning, a social worker brought the boys for a supervised visit to Josh's new rental home in Graham, Washington. It was a bright Sunday. Everything seemed normal. When the boys ran inside, Josh quickly slammed the door, locking the social worker outside. She screamed, banged on the door, called 911, but it was too late. Moments later, the house exploded in flames. The blast was so powerful it shook nearby homes. Firefighters rushed to the scene, but by the time they broke through the wreckage, it was already over. Inside, they found the bodies of Josh Powell and his 2 little sons. He had attacked them with a hatchet before setting the house on fire. The explosion was deliberate. Gasoline had been spread throughout the home. It was a murder-suicide, planned in detail. When police reviewed the timeline, they realized Josh had sent goodbye emails minutes before the explosion to his attorney, his family, and to Susan's relatives. One of them simply read, "I'm sorry, goodbye." And in that one violent act, Josh Powell destroyed what was left of the Powell family, leaving behind no answers. Only ashes and grief. But for investigators, the question still remained. What had happened to Susan? Where was she? Despite everything, her body had never been found. And deep down, everyone, her parents, detectives, and the entire nation, knew that Josh had taken that secret to his grave. But the case wasn't over yet. Because when police went through Josh's digital files, they found disturbing signs that he had planned everything long before that final day. In the end, those discoveries would expose the full darkness of Josh's world and confirm the haunting truth Susan had warned about years earlier. The disappearance of Susan Powell had now become one of the most haunting mysteries in Utah's history. Detectives, friends, and the entire community were desperate for answers, and all eyes were on one man, Josh Powell. In the days following Susan's disappearance, Josh's behavior only grew more bizarre. Instead of showing concern or grief, he seemed irritated, almost defensive. When detectives asked him to come in for another round of questioning, he refused. When they requested access to Susan's phone and email accounts, he resisted. And when police asked to search his car again, he became visibly uncomfortable. Behind closed doors, investigators were uncovering disturbing details about the Powell family dynamic. They discovered that Susan had been secretly recording videos and keeping a journal, a sort of insurance in case something happened to her. In one recording, she looked into the camera and said, "If I die, it may not be an accident." Detectives began to piece together a picture of a marriage poisoned by control and manipulation. Susan's friends described Josh as a man obsessed with money and dominance. He controlled what Susan spent, criticized her constantly, and even made her beg for grocery money. Meanwhile, forensic investigators were working tirelessly. They combed through the Powell home for any sign of a struggle. They found traces of blood on the floor near the couch, blood that later matched Susan's DNA. But without a body, there was no definitive proof of murder. Then, attention shifted to Josh's father, Susan Powell. What investigators discovered inside his home was both shocking and disturbing. During a search, they uncovered hundreds of photographs and videos of Susan, many of them taken without her knowledge. Stephen had filmed her through her window, stolen items of her clothing, and kept obsessive journals describing his infatuation with her. This revelation sent shockwaves through the case. It painted the Powell family in a darker light than anyone expected. And while Stephen's obsession was enough to put him behind bars on voyeurism charges, it did nothing to explain where Susan was. Josh, now under immense scrutiny, packed up his two young sons, Charlie and Braden, and moved from Utah to Washington State into his father's home. Investigators tried to keep tabs on him, but legally there wasn't enough evidence to arrest him. Back in Utah, Susan's family, Chuck and Judy Cox, refused to give up. They held vigils, distributed flyers, and pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. Each passing day felt heavier than the last. In the months that followed, police continued to build their case. Digital forensics experts searched Josh's computer and discovered something chilling. Internet searches about life insurance, murder methods, and how to hide a body in a mine shaft. Despite this, prosecutors still hesitated. Circumstantial evidence alone wasn't enough to convict, and Josh knew it. He taunted the public by giving bizarre interviews, saying Susan ran off with another man, or that she just needed to get away. But one thing was certain, his story was crumbling. Then, in 2011, nearly 2 years after Susan's disappearance, the case took another disturbing turn. Susan Powell, Josh's father, was arrested on charges of voyeurism and child pornography. In the process, police seized his journals and digital files. Inside, they found even more writings about Susan, fantasies that blurred the line between obsession and delusion. This arrest shattered what little stability Josh had left. His relationship with his father was toxic, yet he depended on him. When Stephen was taken away, Josh spiraled. He was forced to move out with his 2 sons and rent a small home nearby. Authorities now feared for the safety of the children. Social workers began monitoring Josh's visits, noting that the boys were showing signs of trauma. One of the boys even said something chilling during a supervised visit, something that made everyone stop cold. He said, "Mommy was in the trunk." Those 5 words reignited the case. It was the break investigators had been waiting for, a glimpse of truth from an innocent child's memory. Detectives rushed to question Josh again, but he refused all interviews. He lawyered up, avoided the press, and began withdrawing from everyone. By this point, Josh had lost his job, his father was in prison, and the walls were closing in. His behavior grew erratic and unpredictable. Friends described him as a man cornered by his own lies. Then, just when authorities thought they might finally be closing in, the story took a horrifying and tragic turn that no one saw coming. The next part reveals the unthinkable, the shocking conclusion that still haunts the memory of Susan Powell's case. By 2012, more than 2 years had passed since Susan Powell vanished. Her parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, had fought tirelessly to protect her 2 young sons, Charlie and Braden, from Josh Powell, who had become increasingly unstable. After Stephen Powell's arrest on voyeurism and child pornography charges, Josh's world began to crumble. He had lost his job, his reputation, and most of his friends. Yet somehow he still managed to maintain partial visitation rights to his sons, despite being the prime suspect in their mother's disappearance. It was a decision that, tragically, would cost 2 innocent lives. On February 5, 2012, a social worker drove the 2 boys to Josh Powell's rented home in Graham, Washington, for a supervised visit, something that had become routine. When she arrived, the boys ran ahead toward the front door, excited to see their father. Josh opened the door, smiled at them, and then, before the social worker could step inside, he slammed it shut and locked her out. The social worker immediately panicked. She banged on the door, yelling for Josh to open it, but there was no response. Then, within seconds, she smelled something, the sharp, unmistakable scent of gasoline. She backed away, grabbed her phone, and called 911. Her voice on the call was frantic. "There's a supervised visit." "Something's wrong." "The father just locked me out. I smell gas. I think he's done something terrible." Moments later, the house exploded. The blast was so powerful that it could be felt blocks away. Fire consumed the entire home in minutes. When firefighters finally managed to control the flames, they discovered what they feared most: the remains of Josh Powell and his 2 sons. The autopsy later revealed the horrifying truth. Josh had attacked his children with a hatchet before setting the fire. Both boys had suffered blunt force injuries, though they likely died from smoke inhalation. Josh Powell had killed his sons, a final, monstrous act to ensure no one else could take them away from him. As news of the explosion spread, the entire nation was in shock. Susan's parents, who had fought for custody of the boys, were devastated. They had hoped to one day tell Charlie and Braden the truth about their mother. Instead, they were left with unimaginable loss. Investigators found that Josh had meticulously planned the murder-suicide. He had withdrawn large sums of money, donated his son's toys to Goodwill, and sent final emails to family members saying goodbye. One chilling message read simply, "I'm sorry. Goodbye." Inside the burned home, detectives found an open gasoline can and evidence that accelerant had been poured throughout the house. It was clear, and this was no accident. After the tragedy, investigators redoubled their efforts to find Susan's body. They combed through deserts, mines, and remote wilderness areas in Utah and Nevada, searching for any trace of her. But despite hundreds of leads, her remains were never found. In 2013, Josh's father, Stephen Powell, was sentenced to prison for voyeurism and possession of child pornography. He maintained his innocence in Susan's disappearance until his death in 2018. Over the years, the case has remained one of the most haunting examples of domestic violence and system failure in America. Many criticized the authorities for allowing Josh any contact with his children, despite the mounting red flags. The state later settled a wrongful death lawsuit filed by Susan's parents for millions of dollars, but no amount of money could ever undo what happened. Susan's family continues to fight for awareness about domestic abuse, manipulation, and the importance of early intervention. They've spoken publicly about their daughter's life, not just her disappearance, remembering her as a loving mother, a kind friend, and someone who deserved so much better. Today, more than a decade later, the Susan Powell case stands as both a mystery and a tragedy. Her body has never been found, and Josh took his secrets to the grave. But one thing remains certain. Susan's story is not forgotten. Her disappearance changed how investigators handle domestic cases, how courts evaluate custody disputes, and how the world recognizes the silent warning signs of abuse. Because sometimes, the most dangerous place for a woman is her own home. And in the case of Susan Powell, the warning signs were there all along.